The desert stretched out before us, endless and unforgiving, a vast expanse of sand and scrub under the fading light of a setting sun. Ryan drove, one hand on the wheel, the other lazily tapping the rhythm of a song on the radio. I sat in the passenger seat, flipping through our map, even though we both knew where we were headed, the border. Mexico. Adventure. A fresh start. We'd been on the road for hours, the towns growing smaller, the spaces between them wider. The air was dry and heavy, the heat of the day lingering even as the sun dipped lower. The road ahead was a single, cracked ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. "You think we'll make it to the border by midnight?" Ryan asked, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced at the map and frowned. "Maybe, if we don't stop. But I don't see how we'll cross without resting first. We've been driving since dawn." Ryan shrugged. "We'll stop when we have to. I'm just saying, it'd be nice to wake up on the other side, you know?" I didn't answer. Something about the growing darkness outside the car made me uneasy. The desert seemed alive in a way it hadn't earlier in the day. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the sand, and the occasional distant cactus looked more like a sentinel than a plant. Then the engine sputtered. Ryan cursed under his breath, pulling over as the car slowed to a halt. The headlights illuminated a stretch of cracked pavement and sand, but there was no sign of civilization. I felt my stomach drop. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Don't know," Ryan muttered, popping the hood and stepping out. "It just died." I followed him into the cooling night air, watching as he fiddled with wires and stared at the engine like it might suddenly decide to fix itself. It didn't. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and something faintly metallic. I shivered. After a few minutes, Ryan slammed the hood shut inside. "It's not going anywhere tonight." "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Ryan pointed down the road. "There was a sign back there, remember? Terlingua, 2 miles. We'll walk. Maybe someone can help." The idea of walking into the desert night wasn't appealing, but what choice did we have? I grabbed my bag and flashlight, and we set off down the road. The air grew colder with every step, the wind whispering through the scrub brush like it had secrets to share. The stars overhead were brilliant, but they offered no comfort. It took longer than I expected to reach the town. Terlingua appeared like a mirage, a cluster of dim lights flickering in the distance. As we approached, I noticed the buildings were old, weathered wood and adobe, their paint peeling, their windows dark. It looked more like a ghost town than a place people actually lived. The first building we passed was a gas station, its single pump rusted and unused. A faded sign above the door read, "Terlingua General Supply." A small, dusty window displayed a few old cans of motor oil and some faded postcards. It looked like it hadn't been restocked in decades. "Think they have a tow truck?" Ryan joked, his voice uneasy. "I doubt they even have electricity," I muttered. We moved deeper into the town, passing a handful of other buildings, a church with a broken bell tower, a diner with a cracked neon sign that flickered faintly, and an inn that looked more like a saloon from an old western. There were people, too, more than I expected. They stood on porches or leaned against walls, their faces partially hidden in shadow. They didn't wave or call out, just watched us with an unsettling stillness. "Hello?" Ryan called, raising a hand. A man stepped out of the inn, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was tall and thin, dressed in faded denim and a white shirt that looked too clean for the dusty surroundings. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes sharp and piercing. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, his voice smooth and even. "You folks lost?" "Our car broke down about 2 miles back," Ryan said. We were hoping someone here could help. The man nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to me before returning to Ryan. You want to stay at the inn tonight? It's too dark to fix anything out there now. I'll send someone to take a look in the morning. Ryan hesitated, glancing at me. Thanks, but... No charge for the room, the man interrupted. Call it hospitality. I didn't like the way he said it. There was something off about his tone, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But Ryan seemed relieved. Thanks, he said. We appreciate it. The man gestured for us to follow him into the inn. The lobby was small and dimly lit, with a worn rug on the floor and a desk that looked like it had been carved by hand a century ago. A single key hung on the wall behind the desk. The man handed it to Ryan without a word, then turned and disappeared into a back room. The room itself was simple but clean, a bed, a dresser, and a single window that overlooked the darkened street. Ryan flopped onto the bed with a sigh, but I couldn't relax. Something about the town, about the people, gnawed at me. It felt wrong. I moved to the window and peered out. The street was empty now, the buildings dark and silent. But just as I was about to turn away, I saw movement, a figure standing in the middle of the road, staring up at our window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't wave. Just stood there, watching. Ryan, I whispered, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. Emma, what's wrong? Ryan asked, sitting up. Nothing, I said quickly, shaking my head. It's nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a terrible mistake. That night, I barely slept. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Terlingua. I barely slept, my mind replaying the strange events of the night before. Ryan was still snoring softly, sprawled out on the bed. I sat by the window, staring at the deserted road and the faded buildings beyond. The figure I'd seen the night before haunted me. I'd convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion, but the unease lingered, settling deep in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. Something about this town felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't quite define. Ryan stirred, sitting up with a groggy yawn. Morning, he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Any sign of life out there? Not much, I said, glancing back at him. It's like this place is asleep. He shrugged. Small towns are like that. People probably don't start their day until the sun's fully up. We'll find someone to take a look at the car, get it fixed, and be out of here by lunch. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he said it felt overly optimistic, almost naive. Still, I didn't argue. We needed to get moving, to get out of this place before the strange atmosphere started to feel normal. After a quick breakfast of stale granola bars from my bag, we ventured out into the town. The sun was higher now, but the streets were still eerily empty. The air was thick and still, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. As we walked, the creak of a wooden sign swinging in the breeze was the only sound. The first stop was the gas station. Ryan reasoned that if anyone could help with the car, it would be someone there. But when we stepped inside, it was like stepping into another time. Dust coated every surface, the shelves lined with faded cans and rusted tools. A cash register sat on the counter, its keys worn smooth. Hello? Ryan called, his voice echoing in the stillness. A figure emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. He was older, with a weathered face and a cowboy hat that looked like it had seen better days. His eyes were sharp, though, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Morning, he said, his voice rough and gravelly. You folks need something? Our car broke down outside town, Ryan said. We were hoping someone here could take a look at it. The man nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on me, unblinking. I'll see what I can do, he said. Might take a while, though. Parts are hard to come by out here. Ryan frowned. How long is a while? The man didn't answer. He just shrugged, his attention shifting back to the rag in his hands. It was clear he wasn't in a hurry to help. Is there a phone we can use? I asked. We need to call someone for help. The man's eyes flicked to me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, something dark and knowing. No phones, he said simply. Closest signal's miles out. I felt my stomach drop. The town had no phones? No cell service? It didn't make sense. Even the most remote places had some way to connect to the outside world. I opened my mouth to press him further, but Ryan put a hand on my arm, shaking his head. Thanks, Ryan said, his tone strained. We'll check back later. The man didn't reply as we left, his gaze following us out the door. Outside, the air felt even heavier, as if the town itself were pressing down on us. This is ridiculous, I said, my voice shaking. No phones? No help? How do these people live out here? Ryan ran a hand through his hair, looking as uneasy as I felt. We'll figure something out, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We wandered deeper into the town, passing more weathered buildings and empty streets. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of people, shadows moving behind curtains, figures slipping into alleys, but no one approached us. It was as if the whole town was watching, waiting for something. Our next stop was the inn's lobby. Ryan thought maybe we could find someone there who'd be more helpful, or at least a map that might show us the nearest real town. The lobby was just as empty as the gas station, the air stale and heavy with the scent of old wood. While Ryan rummaged through the desk drawers, I wandered over to a display of old photographs on the wall. They were black and white, the edges curled and faded. Most showed groups of people, miners, families, children, posing in front of the town's buildings. But the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. The faces in the photos didn't change. They were the same faces we'd seen last night, the man from the inn, the older man at the gas station, and others who had seemed to watch us from the shadows. Their clothes were different, and they looked slightly younger, but it was unmistakably them. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. What is it? Ryan asked, coming up beside me. I pointed to the photos, my hand trembling. It's them, I whispered. They've been here for decades. Ryan frowned, leaning in to steady the pictures. His expression darkened. That doesn't make sense. Before I could respond, a noise from the hallway made us both jump. It was faint, just a soft creak, like a floorboard bending under weight. But in the silence of the inn, it was deafening. Someone's there, Ryan said, his voice low. We turned toward the hallway, but it was empty. The air felt colder now, the shadows deeper. Ryan moved cautiously, peering around the corner. Hello, he called. No answer. Just the faint sound of the wind outside. We decided to leave the inn and head toward the edge of town. The longer we stayed, the more suffocating the place felt, as though the very air was conspiring against us. As we walked, we passed a small cemetery nestled behind the church. Something about it drew me in, despite the knot of fear in my stomach. I want to check this out, I said, stopping at the gate. Ryan looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Why? It's a graveyard. I have a feeling. He sighed but didn't argue, following me through the rusted gate. The cemetery was small, the headstones worn and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible. But as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. Some of the graves looked fresh. The dirt was loose, the headstones unmarked. What the hell? Ryan muttered, crouching beside one of the fresh graves. Why would they bury someone without a name? As he spoke, my eyes drifted to another headstone nearby. Unlike the others, its inscription was clear and sharp, as if it had been carved recently. It read, Emma Harper. Arrived February 17th, 2025. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Ryan, I whispered, pointing to the stone. That's my name. He turned, his face pale. What? I couldn't speak. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could my name be on a grave? How could it have today's date? Ryan grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the gate. We're leaving. Now. But as we stepped back onto the main street, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the town seemed to come alive. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces pale and blank, their movements deliberate. They didn't speak, didn't rush. They simply watched, waiting. And then, from the center of town, we heard it, music. Faint at first, but growing louder. A slow, haunting melody carried on the wind. Where's that coming from? I whispered. Ryan's grip on my arm tightened. The town square. We turned, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. At the heart of Terlingua was an open square, lit by the flickering glow of lanterns. People were gathering there, their faces illuminated by the warm, golden light. But something about them was wrong, something I couldn't quite put into words. As we stood there, frozen in place, the music swelled, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to come from every direction, weaving through the air like a living thing. Ryan pulled me closer, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here. But as we turned to run, the road behind us dissolved into darkness, leaving only the square ahead. The town had made its choice. The music grew louder, a haunting melody that seemed to echo from every corner of Terlingua. It was strange, otherworldly, neither cheerful nor mournful, but something in between, as though it were both a celebration and a lament. The sound wrapped itself around us, pulling us forward even as every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Ryan's hand tightened on mine as we stood at the edge of the square, staring at the gathering crowd. The townsfolk moved with deliberate purpose, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of lanterns strung across the square. The bonfire at the center roared to life, sending embers spiraling into the night sky. They're all here, Ryan whispered, his voice tight with dread. Every single one of them. He was right. The people we'd seen during the day, the man from the inn, the gas station attendant, the shadowy figures watching us from windows and alleys, they were all gathered in the square. But there were more now, far more than I'd seen before. Dozens, maybe even hundreds, of faces filled the space, their expressions calm and unreadable. Some wore clothes so old-fashioned they looked like they belonged in a history book, while others dressed in tattered rags that barely clung to their frames. And then I saw the newcomers. They weren't like the others. Their skin was pale and waxy, their eyes hollow and dark. They moved stiffly, as if their limbs didn't bend quite right, and their faces were frozen in eerie half-smiles. The worst part was their clothing, familiar jackets, jeans, and hiking boots. They looked like travelers, just like us. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Ryan, we have to go. Now. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the bonfire, where a figure was emerging from the shadows. It was the man from the inn, his pale face glowing in the firelight. He raised his hands, and the music stopped abruptly, plunging the square into silence. Welcome, the man said, his voice smooth and resonant, carrying effortlessly over the crowd. Tonight, we gather as we always have, to honor the past and embrace the future. The crowd murmured in approval, a low hum that sent chills down my spine. I glanced at Ryan, but his face was pale, his jaw clenched. I knew he felt it too, something was terribly, horribly wrong. The man continued, his tone almost reverent. We celebrate those who came before us, those who remain among us, and those who will join us tonight. The mountain provides, and we are grateful. At that, the crowd erupted into applause, the sound jarring and dissonant. I saw the newcomers flinch, their stiff movements betraying their discomfort. One of them, a young woman with long blonde hair, turned toward the edge of the square, her eyes wide with panic. She took a step back, as if to run, but two of the townsfolk were suddenly there, their hands on her shoulders. She tried to pull away, but their grip was unyielding. The pale man's gaze shifted to her, his smile widening. "There is no need to fear," he said. "The mountain has chosen you, as it chooses us all." Her screams echoed through the square as she was dragged toward the bonfire. My stomach churned, and I turned to Ryan, my voice trembling. "We can't stay here. We have to leave." Ryan nodded, his face pale. "We'll slip out through the alley," he whispered. "Stay close." We edged toward the shadows, keeping to the edges of the square. The crowd was too focused on the ritual to notice us, their attention fixed on the bonfire and the pale man's voice. The blonde woman's screams had subsided into muffled sobs, and I forced myself not to look back as we crept away. The alley was dark and narrow, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. We moved quickly, our footsteps silent on the dirt path. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. When we reached the end of the alley, we stopped, pressing ourselves against the wall as we caught our breath. The music had resumed, faint but insistent, like a siren's call. "We can't just keep running in circles," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find a way out." I nodded, though I had no idea what that way might be. The town seemed to shift and twist, trapping us no matter where we turned. It was as though the roads themselves were conspiring to keep us here. A sudden noise behind us made us both freeze. It was faint, a soft shuffle of footsteps, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. I turned slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The gas station attendant stood at the other end of the alley, his head tilted to one side, his pale face expressionless. His lips didn't move, but I heard his voice nonetheless, low and distorted, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have tried to leave." Ryan grabbed my arm, and we bolted. The man didn't chase us, but I could feel his gaze burning into my back as we ran. The town seemed to close in around us, the buildings pressing closer, the streets looping back on themselves no matter which direction we took. Finally, we burst into a clearing, a dead end. A low, crumbling wall blocked our path, and beyond it, the desert stretched out into the darkness. Ryan climbed onto the wall, peering over the edge. "I think we can make it," he said. "It's a straight shot to the desert." I hesitated, glancing back at the alley. The whispers were louder now, growing closer. I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head, but they pushed me forward, urging me to run. Ryan jumped down to the other side and held out his hand. "Come on, Emma." I took a deep breath and climbed over, my hand scraping against the rough stone. The ground on the other side was uneven, the desert sand shifting beneath my feet. We ran, the cold night air cutting into my lungs as we pushed farther from the town. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of sound. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The townsfolk were following us. They didn't run. They walked, their movements slow and deliberate, but they were relentless. Their pale faces glowed faintly in the moonlight, their eyes fixed on us. The newcomers were among them, their stiff movements matching the townsfolk now. It was as if they'd already been claimed. Ryan grabbed my hand, pulling me forward. "Don't look back," he said. "Just keep moving." We ran until my legs burned and my chest ached, until the lights of the town were nothing but a faint glow in the distance. But no matter how far we went, the whispers stayed with us, and the feeling of being watched never faded. Eventually, we collapsed onto the sand, gasping for air. The desert was silent now, the stars above cold and indifferent. For a moment, I thought we'd escaped. Then I saw it. In the distance, the faint outline of the town shimmered in the moonlight. We hadn't escaped. We were right back where we started. The sight of Terlingua's glow on the horizon crushed the fragile hope I'd been clinging to. Ryan was hunched over, his hands on his knees, gasping for breath beside me. The oppressive silence of the desert made his heavy breathing seem deafening. I stared at the distant flicker of lights, my pulse pounding in my ears. "We're not getting out," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ryan looked up at me, his face pale in the moonlight. "We will," he said, though his tone was more defiant than confident. "We just have to try another direction." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "We've been running for hours, and no matter where we go, we end up back here. It's like the town won't let us leave." Ryan straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's not the town," he said, his voice tense. "It's them." The memory of the townsfolk following us through the alley sent a chill down my spine. Their blank faces, their slow, deliberate movements, the way they didn't run but somehow always seemed to be closing in, it was unnatural, wrong in every way. Ryan grabbed my hand, his grip firm but trembling. "We're not giving up. Let's move." The glow of the town lingered behind us as we headed into the desert once more. The air was colder now, the wind biting at my skin. The sand shifted beneath our feet, making every step feel like a struggle. The whispers had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt even more unnerving. We walked for what felt like hours, the stars overhead bright and indifferent. My legs ached, and exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thought of those lifeless faces, those unblinking eyes, was enough to keep me moving. But when the lights of Terlingua appeared ahead of us again, I nearly collapsed. "No," I choked out, my voice breaking. "No, this isn't possible." Ryan cursed under his breath, his frustration boiling over. He kicked at the sand, pacing back and forth as if he could will the town to disappear. "It's like we're stuck in a loop," he said, his voice raw with anger. "Like the whole damn desert is conspiring to keep us here." I dropped to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "What do they want from us? Why won't they let us go?" Ryan knelt beside me, his hands gripping my shoulders. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his voice trembled. "We have to. They can't keep us here forever." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. When we finally stumbled back into Terlingua, the streets were deserted, the same eerie stillness hanging in the air. The town felt different now, more alive, as if it were aware of us, watching our every move. The faint glow of the bonfire in the square was still visible, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the buildings. Ryan led the way, his shoulders tense, his head swiveling to scan every alley and doorway. "We need answers," he muttered. "Something to explain what's happening here." The inn loomed ahead, its weathered facade bathed in the orange light of the fire. It looked almost welcoming, but I knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but Ryan pushed forward, his determination unwavering. The lobby was empty when we entered, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The desk sat in the corner, its surface cluttered with old ledgers and yellowed papers. Ryan rifled through them, his movements quick and desperate. "What are you looking for?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Anything," he said. "Records, maps, something to tell us how to get out of here." I moved to the wall of photographs, my eyes scanning the black and white images. The same faces stared back at me, their expressions eerily unchanged. My gaze fell on one photo in particular, a group shot of miners standing in front of a crumbling building. The man from the inn was at the center, his pale face unmistakable. But the date scrawled at the bottom of the photo made my blood run cold, 1927. They've been here for almost a century, I whispered, my voice trembling. And they haven't aged. Ryan looked up, his brow furrowed. What? I pointed to the photo, my hand shaking. It's them. All of them. They've been here for decades, maybe longer. Ryan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the image. How is that possible? Before I could answer, a soft creak echoed through the room. We both froze, our eyes darting toward the doorway. A shadow moved across the floor, long and deliberate. They're here, I whispered. Ryan grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the back of the inn. We need to find another way out. We slipped through a narrow hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet. The whispers had returned, faint but growing louder, like a chorus of voices just beyond the walls. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light. At the end of the hall, we found a door marked storage. Ryan pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Basement, he said. It might lead to the back alley. I hesitated, the thought of descending into the dark, confined space filling me with dread. But the sound of footsteps behind us left no room for debate. The stairs creaked under our weight as we descended, the air growing colder with each step. The faint smell of damp earth and mildew filled my nose, and I fought back a wave of nausea. Ryan's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. The basement was larger than I expected, the walls lined with old shelves cluttered with tools and rusted machinery. At the far end of the room, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling through the crack. Ryan moved toward the door, his flashlight trembling in his hand. This has to lead outside, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as he reached for the handle, the door creaked open on its own. Beyond the door was a small chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center of the room was a shallow pit filled with what looked like ash and bone fragments. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. What the hell is this? Ryan whispered. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the symbols. They were crude, almost childlike, but something about them felt ancient, primal. My gaze fell on a large, withered book lying open on a pedestal near the pit. Ryan reached for the book, his fingers brushing the yellowed pages. Maybe this explains. Before he could finish, the whispers swelled, filling the room with a deafening roar. The symbols on the walls began to glow, a faint, sickly light that pulsed like a heartbeat. We need to get out of here, I said, grabbing his arm. Now. But the door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The whispers grew louder, the light from the symbols intensifying until it felt like the walls were closing in. And then they appeared. The townsfolk materialized from the shadows, their pale faces glowing in the unnatural light. They moved in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on us. The pale man stepped forward, his smile widening. You've seen too much, he said, his voice echoing in the confined space. The mountain has claimed you. Ryan lunged toward the door, but the townsfolk closed in, their movements eerily smooth and coordinated. I backed away, my heart pounding as they surrounded us. The pale man raised a hand, and the whisper stopped. The silence was suffocating, oppressive. Join us, he said, his voice cold and commanding. Or face eternity in the desert. I looked at Ryan, his face pale and stricken. I could see the same question in his eyes that was racing through my mind. Was there any way out of this? The silence in the basement was absolute, the oppressive kind that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. The pale man stood at the center of the room, his hollow eyes boring into mine. Behind him, the townsfolk were still and silent, their faces expressionless, their presence like a wall of inevitability. Ryan tightened his grip on my hand. I could feel him trembling, his breath shallow and uneven. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice breaking the heavy quiet. The pale man tilted his head slightly, as though amused by the question. "It is not what we want," he said, his voice smooth and resonant. "It is what the mountain demands." "What does that even mean?" I snapped, my voice trembling with fear and frustration. "Why can't you just let us go?" The pale man stepped closer, the light from the glowing symbols casting long, distorted shadows across his face. "The mountain keeps what it takes," he said simply. "It has chosen you, as it chose us. To stay is to belong. To leave is to wander forever." "Wander where?" Ryan asked, his tone sharp with defiance. The man's smile widened, though it carried no warmth. "The desert," he said. "The in-between. A place for those who deny their place in the cycle." I felt the weight of his words settle over me, the terrible implication sinking in. The desert wasn't just vast and unending, it was a liminal space, a purgatory for those who resisted the mountain's grip. I thought of the whispers, the way the road seemed to loop back to the town, and the figures we'd seen in the darkness. They weren't just lost. They were trapped. Ryan shook his head, pulling me back a step. "We're not staying here," he said firmly. "We're leaving, no matter what." The pale man's expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to grow colder. "You cannot run forever," he said. "The mountain is patient. It always gets what it is owed." Ryan yanked me toward the door, his grip ironclad as we pushed through the crowd of townsfolk. They didn't move to stop us, but their eyes followed, their gazes like a physical weight pressing against my back. The door slammed open, and we bolted up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The whispers returned as we reached the main floor of the inn, louder and more chaotic than before. They seemed to rise from the very walls, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that overlapped and twisted together into an unintelligible chorus. I covered my ears, but it did little to block out the sound. "We have to get to the car," Ryan said, his voice strained. "What if it doesn't start?" I asked, panic lacing my words. "Then we run," he replied. "We run until we can't anymore." The streets were eerily empty as we burst out of the inn, the flickering lanterns casting long, wavering shadows across the dirt. The bonfire in the town square burned brighter now, its flames unnaturally high, licking at the sky as if they were alive. The townsfolk were nowhere to be seen, but their absence felt intentional, like they were watching from just beyond the edges of the light. The car was still where we'd left it, covered in a thin layer of dust. Ryan yanked open the driver's door and slid behind the wheel, fumbling with the keys as I climbed into the passenger seat. The engine sputtered as he turned the key, refusing to catch. "Come on," Ryan muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." The whispers grew louder, the air inside the car growing colder. Frost crept across the windshield, spidering outward in delicate, crystalline patterns. I looked out the window and saw them, figures moving through the darkness, their pale faces glowing faintly in the dim light. "They're coming," I said, my voice shaking. Ryan slammed his fist against the dashboard. "Damn it!" The engine roared to life, and relief flooded through me. Ryan didn't hesitate, slamming the car into gear and flooring the gas. The tires kicked up dirt as we sped down the road, the glow of the town fading behind us. For a few brief moments, I allowed myself to believe we'd escaped. The road stretched out ahead of us, the desert vast and empty on either side. The whispers had faded, replaced by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of the tires against the cracked asphalt. But then I saw the lights. At first, they were faint, just a soft glow on the horizon. But as we drew closer, my stomach twisted with dread. The buildings of Terlingua came into view, the familiar shapes of the inn, the diner, and the gas station illuminated by the flickering lanterns. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." Ryan's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. "It's not possible," he said, his voice shaking. We were going straight. We didn't turn. The car skidded to a halt in the middle of the road, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. Ryan slammed his hands against the steering wheel, shouting curses into the air. I sat frozen, staring at the town ahead, my mind racing. "They won't let us leave," I said softly, the realization settling over me like a lead weight. "No matter what we do, we'll end up back here." Ryan turned to me, his expression wild with desperation. "There has to be a way. There has to be." The sound of the music reached us again, faint but growing louder. The whispers returned as well, threading through the melody like a sinister undertone. I turned toward the town square and saw the bonfire burning brighter than ever, its flames towering above the rooftops. "They want us to go back," I said. "They're waiting for us." Ryan's jaw clenched. "Then let's give them what they want." "What are you talking about?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "We need to end this," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, whatever they're doing, we stop it, or we'll never get out of here." I wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes silenced me. He was right. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. If we wanted to escape, we had to face whatever was happening head on. We walked toward the square, the music growing louder with every step. The townsfolk were gathered around the bonfire, their faces illuminated by the flames. They turned as we approached, their expressions calm and expectant. The pale man stood at the center of the circle, his arms outstretched, his voice rising above the music. "You have returned," he said, his tone almost reverent. "The mountain welcomes you." "What is this?" Ryan demanded, stepping forward. "Why won't you let us leave?" The pale man smiled, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Because you belong here," he said. "As we all do. The mountain has chosen you to sustain the cycle." "I'm not part of your damn cycle," Ryan snapped. The man's smile faltered, and the air grew heavy. "Then you choose to defy the mountain?" Ryan didn't hesitate. "Yes." The flames roared higher, and the whispers swelled, a deafening cacophony that seemed to shake the ground beneath us. The townsfolk began to chant, their voices blending with the whispers in an eerie harmony. The pale man stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You cannot defy what has already been decided," he said. "The mountain will take what it is owed." Ryan turned to me, his eyes fierce. "Run," he said. "No," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." He grabbed my hand, his grip firm. "You have to. I'll distract them. You get out of here." Before I could protest, he shoved me toward the edge of the square. The last thing I saw was Ryan stepping toward the bonfire, the flames casting his silhouette in sharp relief. The townsfolk surged forward, their hands reaching for him, but he didn't falter. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of Terlingua. The whispers followed me, growing fainter with each step, until they finally faded into silence. When I looked back, the town was gone, swallowed by the desert. But I knew I wasn't free. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel it, the weight of the mountain, the pull of its whispers. It's only a matter of time before it calls me back.